Melusine by Lynne Banks, Chapter 11, The Lopsided Gatepost. You ought to have jumped in without hesitating or shilly-shallying. It should have been automatic. It was evening. Polly had been seen by a local doctor who wanted to take her to a hospital in Niort, the nearest large town 30 miles away, but in the end he'd agreed that her mother could nurse her at home. He bandaged the bump on her head and said severely that she'd had a very narrow escape from drowning. When he said this, he scowled at her parents in a way that made them both hang their heads like guilty children. It was while they were having a scratch supper, it was the uneaten picnic in the kitchen later, that Roger's father, after a long silence, suddenly burst out with his accusation against Roger. Roger didn't even try to answer. He'd been saying the same thing to himself ever since the accident happened. His father's words and the still white faces of both his parents were the last straw. He jumped from his untouched meal and ran into his bedroom, where he shut the door and slammed onto the narrow bed. His misery was too deep for any display of it. He just sat there. He could hear his father and mother arguing in the kitchen in low, tense voices. Occasionally he could make out a bit of what they were saying. Want him to risk drowned too? His fault in the first place, going off like... Make him feel worse than already. Be more responsible. Sister. Started. Bit of naughtiness. Only a kid. Our fault too, I suppose. Poor kid. Go and... There was a scrape of a chair. Roger tensed. His father was going to come in now and try to take back his harsh words. Roger's eyes went to the door almost fearfully, wishing he could lock it, lock his father out, lock everybody out. He wanted to just stay in there by himself until he could calm down, work things out. The only person he could bear the idea of being with was... His mind paused on the thought. He'd started it with the idea of Emma, but suddenly he realized it was Melusine's face that came into his mind. Anyway, his father did come in. He sat down beside him, put an arm around him, said he was sorry. It had just burst out. Nobody could blame Roger, really. He himself didn't know how he would have behaved at such a moment. Nobody knew till it happened to them. It was just that... And here his father started to ramble, explaining why he'd said what he had, how there was this feeling that a chap should just do right and do the right and brave thing instinctively, but lots of chaps didn't. It wasn't their fault, and on till Roger couldn't stand it a second longer. "Shut up, Dad!" he burst out loudly. His father stopped talking at once, patted him on the shoulder, and went out of the room, closing the door softly. Roger sat on. It was good to be alone. He wanted to be. Yet when there was a tap on the door some time later, and Emma whispered, "Can I come in, Rog?" he was relieved. "How is she?" he asked at once. "She's okay. She's asleep. Don't worry. She'll be great tomorrow." "Are you sure?" "Yes, the doctor said." She sat where their father had sat. After a while she said, "I don't understand how you saved her if you didn't jump in." It had been difficult to explain this part of the story. The grown-ups had brushed over it, evidently supposing that Polly had not actually submerged and that Roger had heaved her back into the boat by himself somehow. All they cared about was that she was rescued, but Emma was not so easily satisfied. "Look," he said, "I don't know how to explain it. She sank. She'd gone. Then suddenly she kind of shot up out of the water as if..." He paused. She was gazing at him. He swallowed and then said, "You know that awful bit in Jaws 2 when the shark got that boy and kind of lifted him and shoved him right into the side of the sailboat, like he was dead, and the shark..." Emma shuddered and nodded. The image had haunted them all for weeks, so they'd pretended to joke about it. "It was a bit like that. Something pushed her halfway out of the water." "What was it? How could it?" He shrugged, not looking at her. "Maybe she pushed herself up from the bottom." "No, she was unconscious. She couldn't." "Then..." He turned to face her. "I think it may have been Melusine." "Melusine?" "I know she didn't look as if she'd been in the water, but she had. She went in. I felt the boat get lighter. I looked around and she'd gone." He paused, frowning. A splash? Had he heard a splash? He couldn't remember one, but there must have been. "And then," he went on, "there was a great, I don't know, something twisting and heaving just under the boat. And she came up, Paul. I mean, like, she just shot up. as if something had got hold of her legs and just shoved her out of the water. I don't get it. Me neither. It was really weird. But then, what happened? How did Melusine get back in the boat? I don't know. Suddenly she was there. It made me feel all funny, as if... He didn't finish. After a while, Emma said, I think there's something strange about her altogether. He turned to her quickly. What do you mean? She's weird, that's all. I can't explain. When we were showing her cat's cradle, she'd obviously never done it before, but she learned it at once, her fingers. Have you ever touched her hands? Well, sort of, while we were milking. Didn't you notice how sort of funny they are? You mean cold? Not exactly, just different. Then there's the way she moves. How? She doesn't walk, she glides. Roger felt a jerk of recognition in his head. He stared at her. And her eyes are so... Suddenly he gripped her wrist to silence her. They both heard it. It was a faint sound overhead, a footfall. They looked up at the ceiling. Someone was moving about in the room above. It's her room, whispered Roger. Are you sure? No, but I think so. Can't she hear us? Emma mouthed without sound. Roger remembered how only this morning, Melusine had known where they were going. He mouthed back, maybe. Emma rose and beckoned. Together they tiptoed out of the room into the kitchen, out of the chateau by the kitchen French windows. It was already dark. They'd walked about 20 paces from the garden and turned to look back. Above their flat, with its lights ablaze, was a window with a fainter light. Some skimpy curtains were drawn, but they could see the light glowing through. It's not a proper electric light, said Emma. I don't think they have electricity in their part, said Roger. It must be an oil lamp. It's too bright to be a candle. It's dangerous. It must be awful to be so poor. And to have rich people stay at your house. Who's rich? We're not rich. I mean, compared to them. Compared to them, we're rolling. They stood for a while as dusk fell, gazing at the bulk of the chateau. It was changing from gold to gray and would soon go black. I'd love to explore it, said Emma. Would you? Asked Roger, surprised. He didn't think Emma was the exploring type. Then he thought, she's only saying that to please me, the way he sometimes pretended interest in something his father was keen on, so as to feel closer to him. But he was touched that Emma would bother. But then, she did have a good side, occasionally sympathizing with him when he was feeling down. Listen, I'll show you one thing if you like. Come on before the light goes. He led her over the wall and along the track. The sky was still red in the west. The sun had only just gone down beyond the river line of willows. The glow made the sentry gateposts into silhouettes, one lopsided. Roger stopped in line with the great double front doors and pointed out across the field toward the sunset. See? Those were the original gateposts. There was a massive drive here once, and probably a high wall or a railing, right around the whole chateau. And its grounds must have been a huge garden and stuff in those days. Emma stared. So? Well, I mean, it gives you an idea of how grand the place must have been in its, heyday. You can imagine carriages turning in there and driving straight up to the door, and servants coming down the steps to help people out, like in a film. We've seen much grander houses at home, stately homes, still being lived in. Yeah, of course. The point is... He stopped. She was yawning. The point is, he went on doggedly, not that this is grand now, but that it isn't. Huh? Roger sighed. This was not working. It makes it all that much creepier and more interesting. It's all... That's all. Anyhow, I think it does. Well, I don't, said Emma briskly. She could get brisk, exactly like Polly at times, usually when she was feeling uneasy. I think it's pathetic. I don't want to think about it. I hate this place, if you want to know. I wish we'd gone back to Newport this year. At least we had a proper bath there. Come on, we better get back or we'll be stepping in goat muck again in the dark. And she ran off without looking back. Roger started to follow her and then stopped. He watched her running through the dwindling light back toward the shining welcome of their French windows. He glanced up. The dimmer glow behind the flimsy curtains in Melusine's room, if it was hers, had gone out. Did she go to bed so early? Was she, like himself, feeling hollow and a bit sick and incredibly tired after the day's events? Tomorrow at milking time he would ask her properly, make her tell him what had really happened in the boat. He shrank from the idea, but he knew he must. He would never be able to stop thinking about it otherwise, and while he thought about it, he would never stop feeling guilty. He wondered uneasily whether she had told her father about the danger she had been in, that Roger had let her in for. If the old man took a shot at him now, nobody could blame him. He found himself turning away from the dark bulk of the building and walking slowly out along the overgrown drive toward the gateposts. They seemed to draw him somehow, as if they were actually people, standing there alone and wanting company. He knew it was silly. He knew it was he who was lonely, and that 2 huge blocks of stone wouldn't be much help. Still, he walked on, feeling the tug and tap of the grasses and weeds on his legs, listening to the frog chorus that had just started up from the river, keeping his eyes fixed on the more lopsided of the 2 square pillars. Soon he stood between them. They dwarfed him. Each one, even the leaning one, was twice as tall as himself. He walked to the leaning one and ran his hand over its flat side. The stone seemed to have drunk the day's heat, and now gave it back. He felt comforted in the shadow of this huge old block which loomed over him like a friendly giant, bending down to hear what he said. "Stand up straight," Roger muttered to it. "You're not finished yet." For no special reason, he put his shoulder against it and gave it a mighty shove. It moved, fractionally, but it moved. He even heard it move, a raw grinding sound from its base. He jumped back. There was a second's stillness, then it tilted several inches farther toward its fellow. It was now poised at an angle so acute that it seemed impossible it should not fall the rest of the way to the ground. Roger dared not move, for fear the least vibration should tip the balance. Nothing more happened, though he waited for what seemed like ages. Finally, cautiously, he backed off. The last of the daylight was leaving the western sky. The silhouettes were hardly discernible, but the angle! It couldn't stand long like that. Roger thought of the great tree they had seen, torn up by its roots, a strong wind in this exposed spot, and crash! That'd be the end of the gatepost, and he'd have helped. He heaved a deep sigh. Not this day. Couldn't seem to do anything without it going wrong. Or not his day. Couldn't seem to do anything without it going wrong. And now he had to go back and sleep in that scary larder. Emma would have the big room, because the doctor had said their mother should sleep with Polly. And though his father had been sympathetic last night, he was hardly in a mood to listen to Roger's bogeyman fears. Quite improved, he'd be told to be sensible. Well, he'd have to cope with it somehow, and after the terrors of today, he began to wonder if, after all, he had dreamed last night's intrusion. He stuffed his cold hands into his pockets and tramped back. And that's the end of chapter 11.